Heather McElwee. I'm a guest board member, and it is my great honor to get to introduce Kit and Jessie today. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about them from their bios, and I'm sure you'll learn much, much more as they speak. So Kit Paulson received her MFA from Southern Illinois University and her BFA from Alfred University. She has taught across the U.S. and internationally at schools including Penland, Pilchuck, Corning Museum of Glass, Pittsburgh Glass Center, where I work, Bilberg in Braunau, Germany, National College of Art and Design in Dublin, and Canberra Glassworks in Canberra, Australia. Kit has also completed residencies including the S12 Gallery, S12 Gallery in Bergen, Norway, the Tacoma Museum of Glass, where we are here today, and most recently a 3-year residency at Penland School of Craft. She has received scholarships from Pilchuck Glass School, Corning Museum of Glass, Pittsburgh Glass Center, the Wingate Foundation, and the Glass Art Society. And her work has been published in New Glass Review not once, but in editions 36, 37, 38, and 41. And her work is in the permanent collection of the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian Museum, and she is currently an artist just outside Penland, North Carolina. Jessie spent her childhood in rural Maine, an experience which heavily influences her work. She graduated with honors from Massachusetts College of Art in 2004 with a BFA in glass. Mass art lovers out there. Shortly after earning her degree, she moved to Washington State and has worked for several well-known and talented artists while refining her own technique and developing her own artistic practice. She also worked for and was a student at the world-renowned Pilchuck Glass School just up the street here. Jessie was also involved with Pratt Fine Arts Center in Seattle, working as both a studio coordinator and an instructor, and it was at her time at Pratt she received the 2008 John and Mary Shirley Scholarship. In 2011, Jessie received her MFA from the Ohio State University. So I'm going to turn it over to these guys to tell you more about themselves and their work. Take it away.
Thank you, Linda. So, I'm Kit Paulson, and this is Jessie Blackmer. And today we're going to tell you about our mutual love of tiny glass. And we'll get into a little bit of history and show off some contemporary small glass and discuss how working small can open up great possibilities. And then at the end, we're going to demo a couple of tiny things. We're each going to demo one thing and talk a little bit about our equipment and strategies. Mostly when we talk about contemporary tiny glass, we're talking about flameworking, but it wasn't always like that. Way back in Egyptian and later in Roman times, flameworking and furnace working looked a lot more similar to each other. Both happened in clay and earth furnaces heated by burning wood. Bead-making furnaces, where the small glass was happening, were a little smaller than glass-blowing furnaces, but other than size, they looked pretty similar. So the largest photo on that screen shows a recreation of an ancient Roman glass-blowing furnace. And that top photo is a Roman oil lamp with a relief decoration showing a glassblower at work, which I thought was pretty perfect because later small glass making started happening with the use of oil lamps similar to that one. And then the bottom photo shows an archaeological excavation of an ancient glassblowing furnace. Core forming, the process of creating vessels on cores made of clay and dung, preceded glassblowing and shares many decorative techniques with bead making, as well as using furnace technology of a similar scale. Core forming is a nice bridge between the small bead furnace technology and glassblowing furnace technology because it makes use of crucibles of molten glass, but the vessels are built on something that resembles a bead mandrel. And this affects the scale at which it is possible to produce core-formed objects. Ancient bead-making furnaces were likely small earth and clay chambers in which the beads were heated from below, similar to contemporary Japanese volcano-style torches, if you've ever seen pictures of those where the flame is coming up from underneath instead of going out forward. And the heat coming out from the top of the furnace was enough to melt glass rods that had been previously produced from glass melted in larger glass-blowing furnaces. So they weren't getting hot enough to actually make glass, but they were getting hot enough to melt pre-made glass. Jumping forward considerably, let's take a look at flameworking in the Renaissance, when technology had moved away from earth and wood furnaces to small oil lamps made hotter by means of foot-powered bellows. And this somewhat fanciful illustration includes some of the things that were made by Renaissance flameworkers, including the beginnings of scientific apparatus and glass eyes. and we'll talk a little bit more about those two things a little later. Here's a closer look at a little flame working oil lamp and table equipped with bellows, so you can kind of get an idea of how that works. From the perspective of a modern glassmaker, it seems almost unbelievable that such an arrangement could make glass hot enough to melt. A couple of things made this style of production possible. One was the comparative softness of the glass, so think soft like Moretti Effitrate, COE 104, or even possibly softer. And next time you have some soft glass stringers and a candle, take a moment to play around and discover that it's quite possible to bend and even tack fuse stringers in a candle flame. The other thing making this style of production possible was that it was usually practiced in close proximity to furnace glass, often as an associated or cottage industry. And in many cases, flameworkers were not batching their own glass, so they were not mixing up the materials and bringing it up to melting temperature, but they were using rods and tubes specially pulled for them by nearby furnace workers. So these little lamps didn't have to bring the material all the way up to batching temperatures, only to remelting temperatures. Some arrangements also featured a small brick or refractory material reflecting wall close behind the lamp flame, so that the heat was soaked into that refractory and then reflected back into the work area, which made things stay hotter for longer. And you can see this arrangement in that small top illustration. These lamps with bellows arrangements continued into the 19th century with various oils, including vegetable, animal, and later petroleum oils used for fuel. So what kind of tiny stuff was everybody making on these low-tech torches? Many, many wonderful things, all wonderful tiny things. One of the most wonderful, as far as tiny scale or tiny detail is concerned, were these Verre de Navarre figurines made from the 15th to the 17th century in Navarre, France. And many were really, really small. I think the figures in these two photos are about 2.5 inches tall, so they're about like that tall. And there are other even tinier examples. They were often incorporated into cases and dioramas with the structure and scenery made from a variety of other materials. So these two are these framed scenes, and I think the scene together is about this big. So all those tiny little parts in there fit within this pretty small space. Another arena in which small glass production excelled was in the making of scientific apparatus in the beginning of the scientific revolution. In some sense, the age of reason and the beginnings of science as we know it were quite dependent on glassmakers producing small things. These are two types of flame-worked thermometers made in the 17th century, and there's a super cool collection of very early proto-scientific glass in the Galileo Museum in Florence, Italy, and both of those two things are in there. And that's all flame-worked soft glass that was made hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Glass eyes were another historical stronghold of small glass making. Venetian flameworkers brought glass eye technology to Paris, and German glassmakers adapted it for use in the glassmaking center of Lauscha in Germany in the 19th century. And one man, Ludwig Müller-Uri, is credited with adapting the French methods for use with the specific type of glass which was already being manufactured in Lauscha, which is another example of small glass working cooperatively with large furnace operations. Another center of small glass manufacture was northern Bohemia, what is now Czechia, in the edges of the Bavarian forest in Germany. And this type of small glass production shares a lot of features in common with some of the other types mentioned. It was done with small ovens that are a little bit more like tiny furnaces than they are like torches. And it was done in proximity to larger glass furnaces for the availability of materials. And it was also mostly a cottage industry. So the ends of large diameter rods, almost like the diameter of a color rod for furnace glass, were heated in a small furnace and then stamped multiple times with large kind of plier-looking things with small carved button dies to mold the glass. And then that process ended up with ribbon-like sections containing multiple buttons that were then snapped apart, and the edges trimmed with small cutting wheels by hand, and then pretty roughly cold-worked. And other small pressed items such as fancy bottle stoppers and beads were made using the same techniques. This sort of production carried on into the mid-20th century, and a very small number of makers that continue to do this today. So let's move forward with a little bit about the contemporary possibilities of small glass making. This is a photo of Tyler Gordon. I think it's a very tiny photo, I'm not sure, but it looks pretty small up here. So this is Tyler Gordon with his self-contained, untethered flameworking apparatus, which is a portable flameworking arrangement that allows him to, for example, flame work while walking down the street or in a canoe. And I guess not everybody wants to flame work in a canoe, but Tyler's contraption demonstrates that small flame working can be very self-contained, portable, and space efficient. Highlighting the work of some contemporary makers of small glass, we'll start with the work of Kiva Ford. While Kiva is perfectly capable in the realm of regular sized glass, think like giant scientific apparatus, he's also an exceptional maker of really, really tiny things. Cesare Toffolo is also a remarkable maker, remarkable in the way that he's able to scale his work both up and down. And this photo with the hand gives some scale to the things in the other photo. I think they're all about that size. Jessica Jane Julius effectively uses small-scale techniques to create installations with much larger presence. Her flamework components form massive volumes constructed from tiny elements. David Willis is another artist who uses small-scale techniques to build much larger structures. His work moves from unimaginably small details to human-sized environments. In addition to his small-scale flameworking activities, Willis also constructs large-scale images out of layers of individually placed tiny pieces of frit. Yoko Doi is another artist who works to describe microprocesses in nature using small-scale glass techniques. Her work is often minuscule in scale, so that maple leaf in that picture there is about the size of it can fit in the palm of your hand. But she also uses those small things to build up larger objects. Kare Russell Poole uses small-scale glass techniques to make a larger impact in ways that are reminiscent of the way that historical flameworking has existed as an ancillary activity to furnace glass. Her work often incorporates other materials in thoughtful ways also. Kentaro Yanagi makes mildly absurd, fairly giant mechanical contraptions built from small movable components. And working small allows him many possibilities for moving parts, and it allows him to build up scenes made of loosely connected components. Young-Ho Park is a younger artist entering the world of small glass. He uses small, repeated motifs to build larger forms. So these objects, as far as I understand it, are about the size of the diameter of a beach ball. And Daphne Kaufman uses small components to create larger context and relationships between objects. Each piece demands the attention of the viewer with its detail. Both Jessie and I have shared similar stories in having started out in furnace glass where beams are large and slowly gravitating toward the smaller side of things. When I was starting out in glass in the early 2000s, there was a prevalent opinion that flameworking was hardly real glass. My university and many others had a sad, rarely used Carlisle torch gathering dust in a corner because hardly anybody knew how to even turn it on, let alone what it might be used for. And I was lucky enough to be influenced early by Carmen Lozar. This is one of her pieces up there, who was a graduate student while I was doing my undergraduate studies. And she introduced me to the possibilities of flameworking, but it wasn't really until many years later that I became interested in it. I pursued smaller and smaller details in the hot shop, refusing to admit for many years that flameworking might be a better way to achieve those tiny details. Finally, I started flameworking with furnace glass colors, and then eventually let go of furnace glass altogether. Switching over to borosilicate allowed me both greater detail and larger scale, if that makes any sense, creating large things from small components. And on the very practical side, I was recently able to use the tiny scale of my production work to keep my online shop open while I was living abroad for 6 months. So I developed a very simple inventory system which allowed a friend at home to simply pull a labeled pre-wrapped piece off a shelf, pop it in a padded box, stick a mailing label on it, and drop it off at the post office. My production pieces are also small enough that I was able to make more stock when I had studio access abroad, and pack up 50 to 100 pieces in a box that costs around $20 to ship back to the States. And none of this would have been possible if I had been making large things. I have also leveraged the possibilities of working small in my sculptural work while working abroad. I have deliberately restricted the scale of my work to a size that I can safely transport home by hand on an airplane. And I often travel with a small box filled with pillow stuffing, and if the thing does not fit in the box, it just stays where it is. I'm going to hand this over to Jessie.
All right. Is my mic working? Awesome. I got pretty obsessed with learning sculpture techniques to make a very small, very large, and imposing. This is a glass kidney stone. So it's 28 individually sculpted pieces that were put together with the help of 8 other people and someone else to turn the blowpipe. And it's about 18 inches in diameter. So I went from making work like this and working for people who could show me how to make work like this to then starting to move on. So this is from a series basically about my personal medical history. So the next piece is also in that realm. So I was again taking a tiny, tiny tip and making it large and imposing and putting it on an 8-foot portrait rash, essentially. So this allowed me to start thinking about the size of what I was making relative to the context in which I was putting it, and start thinking more about how to use the glass itself and its properties to draw the viewer in instead of overwhelming the viewer with scale. And that brought me to this work. And so I kind of came into frameworking very reluctantly. I waited as long as I possibly could to pick up the new technique. I don't know why it's been so long. But like Kit, I did not have, I didn't actually have access to it at Master when I was there as an undergrad. So I took a class at Pilchuck, and this was an installation that I did during that class where I recreated the salmon berries that were growing all around us, and then replaced the ripe berries with the glass berry itself. Creating almost this like magical tunnel where you walk in and you can sort of experience the space differently because of the glass itself and the environment it creates. So that got me thinking again about how do I take these small scale objects or forms and take them out of the context of an installation and put them in the context of the gallery. So again, using the method that I did with the tick and the rash face, I created the branch or bramble that the berries were on, and then essentially framed them and created these like sort of precious little frames and boxes, and for these tiny little wonderful little berries that were just sort of pinned gently to this fabric backing. Additionally, I went into other spaces, or mundane ones perhaps, to change how you might think of or how you might experience something as simple as the grocery store. So these are cast crystals. This is a kiln-working process. Potato sprouts were pushed into the potatoes themselves. So all of this kind of work was getting me closer and closer to using flame working as a primary part of my practice as opposed to just an accessory part. I super inspired by the Flashka flower collections and anyone basically working in botanicals to get that kind of realism into the work and sort of transcend the quarter-inch thickness that glass wants to be. So to do that, I started using furnace glass very much in the way that other more ancient flame workers did, where I was creating colored tubes and cane in the hot shop, which is very kind of fast and straightforward, and then really applying the details and working them on the torch itself, where essentially it's far less expensive for me to do that for hours than it is for me to try and make these small works in the hot shop. So I created an outdoor installation that was up for 3 weeks at the Archives Grand Rapids. So these tiny glass flowers were put in the ground basically around this gigantic altar sculpture. So I was really, really emphasizing the preciousness of the glass itself, and also these were all sort of either threatened or endangered species. And they had QR codes next to them where you could actually use your phone, and you could see the University of Michigan site where that had the description and the general location for these flowers. So trying to create these like kind of precious moments and draw people into the detail and sort of ask people to look very, very closely at a space that they already previously been through. So kind of jumping pretty far forward, sort of using mice as kind of like this metaphor, and I'm not super original either, but looking at these tiny sort of vulnerable glass forms, again, relying a lot upon detail to create an object or a form that was both endearing as it was disgusting. So really trying to play around with the psychology of that to create more interesting work. And again, I'm still working in furnace last year, having created lines and forms, and then I started to really cheat. And so I started creating kind of larger piles. I made one more, and so the underside of this is actually kind of a bowl, like an icky blown bowl with some bits on it, nothing you're ever going to see, but it allowed me to build up a nice volume without losing the detail I might if I had to truly like make 40 million of these little mice. So I was able to put them together on this bowl, arrange them without the intensity of the hot shot, right? That's also a big thing. Like having 8 people together and directing them to make a large or complicated sculpture is a whole different skill set and a different kind of like energy that they're applying to the work itself, I think. So kind of being able to take back that energy and apply it in a different way, thinking about multi-process works, and specifically thinking about how I can use flameworking to do that. So this is the finished piece, which was in the exhibition in Bergen, Norway, which is Bethlehem. It's a yearly exhibition. It's the only place it's been showed because it was immediately purchased by the museum collection, which is like, okay. So, you know, our reasons for choosing flameworking, I think, are multi-layered. The setup is far simpler than having a hot shop and having access to a hot shop 100% of the time. So the equipment itself is pretty inexpensive. I did most of my work for the first few years of flameworking on a $100 national torch. Like I just started using my Carlisle, basically. So it doesn't cost a lot to get going and to get melting and to get creating. And then the equipment itself can be taken with us. Like my Carlisle came with me to Norway. Kit brings stuff sometimes. She's kind of a rock star, so maybe people provide things for her wherever she goes. Yeah, and then as she was saying, like the smaller scale works can be far more easily transported for far less money. I was in an exhibition back in Norway again, and had shipped things from the United States, and it cost me like $100 to send all this work, which spread out, looked like a lot. Had a very bigger impact. And then the other thing is what I love about the flameworking community in general is it's all about what you can get away with. Okay? And that's really, really exciting, that level of innovation. And I think it's going to be really amazing to see how flame workers continue to incorporate alternative energy sources like biomethane and like at-home versions of these, because it is an accessible studio to have in your garage or in like the bus that doesn't leave your property, or in the random trailer or shed you buy, or get from your Buy Nothing group. Like it really is accessible, and I'm very interested to see where that accessibility starts to create new levels of ingenuity in terms of energy efficiency. So that is my presentation. And I'm gonna do a demonstration and follow my kit. So, presentation.
Yeah. here.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
I want to try and get some shots, like for like whatever. I just don't want to like bring it quick.
It doesn't matter, dude. Yeah, they'll see you, but it's okay, man. Yeah.
But what I'm going to do is I want to give you a little bit of background on what I'm doing today. So I'm going to demo one of the mice or two mice or whatever time allows. I have some sort of examples here of the tools and the equipment that I use. So this is just kind of like I said, it's just a lumpy bowl. It's just material in the right color to create a nice volume. This is like what I use to make that larger pile. I also, in terms of, I'm always looking for a way to become more efficient with my time. And so these are less detailed little pinky mice. And if you all want to pass them around or something, you totally can. So I've got, I don't know if it like works with COVID. Don't lick them. And then like here's a really creepy one because sometimes you just need like a little face poking out. So I get lots of like really creepy little bits of mice that hang out in the studio with me. It's like I have a cat.
So those kind of go underneath other ones?
Exactly.
Wow.
So instead of making 200 like super detailed mice, I only really need to make about 100 of them and make sure they're the ones on the outside. So I really love cheating. I really like using all the tricks and tools I have to make complicated works. In that same vein, this is actually, I use a mold to make the main body parts of the mice themselves. So what I'm really doing is I'm roughing out a volume so they're all essentially about the same size. And this allows me to work a lot quicker to get some of those really more like anatomical markers, right? So shoulder blades, hip bones, where the head and neck separate, where the shoulders come in. So just kind of, it's really nice, especially with soft glass, to just be able to punch that out. And it also means that when I'm using these, so fancy, right? So where when I'm using these chunks of glass that I've made in the hot shop, so these are sometimes just rolled in powder, but these are actually color cups that I just do over and over again. Actually, because I wanted to get good at doing color cups. You know, I used it as a way to get better at a skill that I previously didn't have. But this is about 4 layers of color to make a really dense, small blank to then sculpt with. And the interior color is a very vibrant red, so that when I press into the mold, you see hints of that red color coming through, just kind of like to sort of reference the internal organs, and then you have that kind of variation in your glass or in your light feature. I worked for a full season for Karen Willenberg Johnson and Jason Johnson, and a lot of the techniques that I use on the torch are definitely super, super influenced by the processes that they taught me. So in that same vein, I have a couple different powders here, and I just roll in them. I don't get too fancy with them. I apparently melt them a little bit. So I have my blanks, they're heating up here. They've been up at temperature, I think they've been up to about 1010 for a few minutes. I'm just actually gonna use today to do a test. I wanna make a darker pink pinky mouse. So when I first started making these, because it's been a couple rounds of making them, I used to work on a metal rod, just a stainless steel, so I was coming from the hot shop and I was working on sort of a tiny petite. And then I started to kind of trust the soft glass a lot more, so now I pick up things on glass rods instead. Find that they crack far less, and I've gotten a little bit faster at making them, so I don't always preheat, but like, it's so nice to be able to. So, I don't have a thing to make fire. It's weird, right? Thank you. I didn't like this up before, so. I didn't do a test run yet, so I'm gonna let those air bleed out a little bit so my mix isn't absolute shit. These mice really don't require a torch this hardcore. I could probably do it on the Smith little torch like cable paneling, but I haven't done it, so I thought gas would probably be the wrong time to try. It was the right time, and it's not one or the other. Okay. So I'm just going to pick up on my flank. Okay, so I'm somewhat vaporizing a little bit that outer layer of color. So I'm just going to add a little bit back in. Just a couple rolls as I heat it up. I have quite a bit more material that I'm actually going to use. I tend to try and make little sort of chiclet chunks that give me 2 mice per chunk. Now, one thing about this particular mold and the way it's designed, I actually want it to kind of squeeze out on the edges, because that will give me these kind of flaps of skin that I can kind of press around, and it actually makes for a more realistic look. So we'll try and make kind of a chunky mouse. Definitely not the front of the litter. Just a nice, even, all over TV. Into the mold. Press. Nice little mushy pink mouse. It's like a piece of chewed gum. So first thing, so I'm going to try and just work from head to back and pressing in these little flaps. Getting that neck kind of cut in, piece together. gonna come back here and just hit things, keep everything just a little bit happier. Just sort of gently massage it just a little extra on that end, which gives me a point to your face as well. Of course, like I talk about learning to trust the glass and the just some really basic shaping. And now, drawing some eyes. So I've got my eyes on there, and I'm going to cover them up with the eyelids. And then just a nice dusting of powder over it so that it looks like that closed eye, so you can see that dark eyeball glow. So now moving that material, that overfill in the mold around a little bit more to create little lumps for the arms and legs. additional material. It's a good example of why I don't do boro and soft glass on the same day. And end up with problems. Okay. So I found that the mice looked better when they're kind of curled up and snuggled up as opposed to kind of spread out. So most of the detailed mice that I made are very sort of curled and protected. Making sure everything's kind of happy. And then nice. And then on and on for hours and hours and hours.
It's really creepy.
That's what I'm going for. Yeah. So any questions about that at all before we...
Can you hear me if I make shouting noises? Yeah, okay, because I don't think I can hold the handheld mic and flame work at the same time.
You can go back to that, and I can just mirror you and make it shout.
I'll start shouting. So I'm gonna make a little, just a little pretty simple flower with petals, but the thing that I want to talk about is bridging, which is a really nice small scale glass technique that you can't really do in the hot shop. You can't do it in the hot shop because in the hot shop you're always heating up everything all the time, so if you try to hold up important pieces of glass with structures made of glass that are just temporary to hold things in place, everything is squiggling around all the time. So it's a very specific flame working thing to be doing. And then it's also really useful for borosilicate flame working because you need to get things very, very, very hot in order to join them structurally together. So in soft glass, you can take your cup handle and you can stick it on the side of your cup and give it a little pull and then stick it on and then go on with your life. and it will stay there stuck forever. It's not going to crack because there's a small acute angle between the end of your handle and the body of your cup. And boro, you just can't get away with that. If there's a little acute angle in there where your handle joins the body of whatever, it's going to crack from right there. And so a nice way of getting around that is to just temporarily hold things in place while you can get them hot enough to be able to have them stick together permanently. So that's why bridging is super awesome. And I'm using this little torch. This is the Smith Little Torch, and this thing's awesome.
Oh, they're off. Sorry.
Wait, only one.
That's weird.
So this is a Smith Little Torch, and this thing is a game changer as far as being able to make tiny things and then use them to build up giant things, because you're not stuck right here at a bench torch. You can just go wandering around the wilderness with this thing. And it also, like, the Smith Little comes with, I think, 5 different tips on it. 7 is the largest and 3 is the smallest. And you can actually get a fairly substantial flame with this tiny little thing. Like, it's not a small flame. And then you can also get an incredibly tiny flame just with this largest tip. So, for itty bitty tiny things. And then if you want to go smaller than that flame, you can step down in the torch tip sizes. Anyway, but this is like a good default size that I use a lot of the time. So I'm gonna make this little flower. It's gonna have 5 little petals, and I'm gonna prepare those petals first. And I'm just gonna do it in clear, because what I really want to talk about is the bridging part. I don't want to really talk about anything fancy with colored glass, because that stuff takes too long. So I'm just gonna make some little flat petals. And this is very often the way that I build things. I make a bunch of components first, and I get all my components made before I start to actually assemble the finished piece. So I'm just building up a little gather here. And this would go maybe a little bit faster on the bench torch. I could get a little bit of a bigger flame, but it is quite possible on the tiny flame. Squish that. Oh, actually, I'll do another little, give it a little bend, make it slightly more petal-like. And then when I make something like this where I'm trying to stretch a flat surface, I want to put most of the heat in the flat parts so that the edges don't start to curl up and become a spear, which is what glass likes to do. So give that a little pull. And then when I remove this from the rod in my left hand, I want to leave a little connection point on there, because I know that this is going to get attached to something later, and I don't want to be trying to attach that to a really, really thin spot on my little petal. Snap that off there. Put that aside over here somewhere. And another one. So the Smith Little Torch, I got my Smith Little because it was cute, but I didn't really actually know anything about it or what anybody was doing with it. And then I was really afraid of it for about 1.5 years, and occasionally I would just open the box, but I never actually used it for about 1.5 years after I got it. But it turns out it's super awesome.
Did you have to turn down the oxygen pressure to get the flames better in there?
You do not. I think my understanding is that it maybe saves your hoses a little bit if you turn down the pressure, but you can run it on, like this is at, the propane's at 10 and the is at about 20,
Okay.
and you can totally run it on that pressure. They do make little turn down knobs for it that you can plumb into your line, which I guess you could use if you wanted, but I was using some for a while and then one of them cracked and I took it out and realized that I could use the torch without it and then never put it back together. So it's nice to be able to make components separately and have them all kind of next to each other to look at. You can size things up a little bit better that way. And because this is borosilicate glass, I can just take off my little components and bench tool them. So by the time I have the 5th one done, the first one will be cool to the touch, and it won't have cracked in that time because it is borosilicate. It does need to be annealed eventually, especially once you make a complicated object out of it, but just tiny little things like that are pretty happy on the bench. So here is our 3rd pedal. Give it a little twist. At home I would normally do this on my Carlisle, which has a little graphite marber on it, so it's a little bit easier to shape things, give things that cup shape with that graphite marber. And I think a lot of times the tendency in making little connection points, especially for sort of organic things like little flower petals or leaves or whatever, is to make that end of the leaf where it joins, or the end of the petal where it joins the flower, to make that really thin and delicate. And that probably would look better, but it's not very structurally sound. So I always make those connection points a little bit chunky, so it's easier to attach them to an object, and it's also likely that they will stay on the object longer. Two more here to go. Any questions while I'm doing the same thing over and over again 2 more times? No questions?
Do you base your annealing cycle off of the amount of connections or components that are on a piece?
No, just thickness. If it's thicker, anneal it longer. If it's thinner, don't take so long. If all your connections are good.
Speaking of annealing, can you expand on that? Because your stuff is so small. Do you have to do anything to deal with slumping in the kiln at traditional temperatures?
Sometimes I've had problems with that. So I can't remember what piece I was making, but it was a pretty big thing and it had some pretty long spans of length of rods that weren't really supported. And it ended up, I used a hot shot kiln to anneal it, and it ended up slumping quite a bit. And so then after that, when I needed to use a hot shot kiln again for another big piece, I did a test of the annealer before I put my thing in it. So I built like a tower of bricks and then had long lengths of rod.
Yeah.
So I could figure out like where the hot spots were, because it was a very, very uneven kiln. And then place my object accordingly. Or actually, I think in that case I was just like, oh, okay, this is never going to work. I'm going to use a different kiln.
Right.
Do you tend to work start to finish on projects, or do you have a lot of things that are sort of like
A lot of things going on all the time. I don't know if that's a sign of not having one's shit together, but and a lot of times with projects that have a lot of repetitive parts, I'll make components for something, I'll pile them up until I get kind of tired of making components for the moment, and then I'll put them all together, and then I'll go back to making components.
are you able to use track of the time investment in pieces, or is it too hard?
I think I'm perfectly able to keep track of the time that goes into pieces, but whether I actually do that is a different story. Okay, so here's all our little petals. And a lot of times when I'm doing this, especially if I'm making something with like complicated color preparation of little bits like that, I'll make extras because it's really easy to, you know, drop them on the floor or lose them in my rubber format, etc. So it's nice to have extras. But I don't think I'm gonna drop any or lose any in this case. And if I do, that was so simple to make that it wouldn't take me a whole lot of time to just really quickly make another one. So I've got my petals made, and now I'm gonna make the center of my flower over here. And I wanna build up enough mass for the center of this flower so that it's big enough that I can heat just one side of it without the whole thing kind of flopping over. So if it's thinner, I can't really do that. If it's a little bit thicker and has more mass, I can heat up 1/5 of it and the other 4/5 won't go anywhere. So I have I think that's a big enough mass. I'm sorry it's so tiny. You probably can't see it very well from back there.
We got a good shot.
Oh yeah.
Thanks, dogs.
So I've got some mass on there, and then I want to be able to bench cool this and take it off of the rod later. So I'm going to make a little spot where I have like almost like a little neckline where I can easily put a little bit of heat into a thin part so that I won't have to go back and put heat into a thick part that's already cold. So I want to do that now before I go any further, while I still have the heat in that mass. And I want to make that long enough so that it's far away from the mass that I can get in there with a small flame and remove it later. So now I'm going to do a little bit of detail for the center of the flower. And you could go totally crazy on detail this way. If I scaled up this flower just a little bit, I could add all sorts of stamen and extra petals and little sepals at the bottom, etc., etc. But there's not really time to do that today. But all of that is possible with these techniques. So I'm just putting little dots on there, making sure that all my seals are nice, hot seals, no sneaky cold seals in there. So I've got five little dots on there. And then, so these have cooled while they've been sitting there. And this is another nice thing about working this way. A lot of times in flame working, you end up with the problem of I have this weird shaped object and I have no way of holding it because tweezers can't grab it or grabber can't grab it. And if you are working with bench cool parts, you can a lot of times just pick them up in your hand and put them where they need to go. I think I didn't leave myself quite enough room to do that, but if it was just a little bit bigger, I could just stick that on with my fingers. I'm gonna use tweezers because these are not too difficult to hold on to. So I'm gonna stick the first two on, just tack them. So this is not a good connection, but that's okay because I'm gonna bridge them and go back and make sure that that connection is good. So that first one is tacked on, and then I'm gonna tack the second one on. And another nice thing about tacking things together, tacking and then welding things together, is that I know from dealing with myself for a pretty long time that if I have an opportunity to put something on upside down, backwards, and diagonal, I will do it. And so if it's just tacked on there, like if I had put this one petal on here and it was upside down, backwards, and diagonal, I could just let it cool a little bit and then, well, I did too good of a job, and then just snap it off and it would not be a big deal. And then I could try harder the next time. So I'm gonna bridge this, and when I'm bridging to a little, something like a pedal that has a particular axis, I like to stick it to the very point of the thing and give myself a little bit of room to remove that later. So I'm kind of along the axis of that pedal. I'm not at an oblique angle like that, because if I go at an oblique angle like that, that's a little bit harder to remove later. So I'm gonna stick that on there, nice hot seal, and then bend that around and just draw glass out from this 3mm rod over to my first pedal and stick that on there. And then pull that off. So now I've got those two. This pedal is held up by this pedal by that bridge, and that means I can get this connection point really hot, and it's not going to flop around. And I'm just making sure I have a really good seal on there. And I'm also making sure that I'm pointing the flame in this direction toward this first pedal and not accidentally splashing flame onto that other pedal, because if I heat up both of them, they will both flop around. And I also want to make sure that I go all the way around that connection. So a lot of times people will only make that good weld from the back, and then there's a big old cold seal on the front. So I want to make sure I get all the way around that pedal. And now that that one's cooled off, I can work on this one. And make sure that's a nice weld. Go all the way around, and I want to see that glass, those two separate sections of glass just flowing into each other. And then my third pedal is slightly less nerve-wracking than the first two, because once you sort of tack something on and don't weld it in, it's a little bit of a ticking time bomb. And you don't have all the time in the world to bridge things together. So I'm going to attach that and then draw that glass out. Bridge to the next closest thing, which happens to be this other bridge over here. And your bridges don't have to be beautiful, they just have to be structural. So I don't care if it looks ugly as long as it's all hot seals holding everything up. If you're trying to hold things up with cold seals, things will start to fall apart. Go all the way around. And then two more pedals. With clear, I have quite a bit of wiggle room and time. So I'm not worried about this thing cracking before I get to the last pedal. The color is a little bit, you have a little bit less time. So I wouldn't like put on three pedals and then stop and get a sandwich and then come back and put the other two on.
Are you talking about the center sphere?
Yeah, because there's quite a bit of quite a mass of glass there, so I don't want that to cool completely before I finish.
But you don't try to reheat it at all as you're working?
Yeah, I'm not worrying about flashing it. Using super tiny bridges like this because they don't really get in the way. If I use this 3mm rod just as it was without stretching it, it takes up a lot of space and it weighs a lot. And it's also kind of slow to heat up. So I like just stretching out that glass into little tiny bridges. And they hold up a surprising amount of weight, which is pretty cool. But if I was making something larger, I would scale up the size of that bridge material. All right. So that's where we are so far. And so that thing, all of those pieces are very firmly attached to this thing, which is great. That's the whole point of this. So now I'm going to take those bridges off, which is also super simple. I'm going to break the connections between them first, just heating up the middles and getting that glass out of the way. I do it with tweezers sometimes. Sometimes I'll do it with a little piece of trash rod, depending on what situation I'm in. Sometimes it's easier to get in there with glass than it is to get in there with a tool, but right now it's super easy to get in there with a tool. So I break those connections between the petals, and then I'm going to remove each bridge individually. And if I had color on there, I would try to remove a little bit of color with each bridge so that I knew that I wasn't leaving any clear on there accidentally. It also makes it look nicer. Nice and pointy. Sit on there. Does not matter that much. And then one last bridge. And then we've got our little flower. And then usually when I do this, everybody's like, but how do you hold on to it to get it off the stick? Which is a good question. And usually what I do is just wait for it to cool and then hold it in my hand and take it off. I'll do it with the tweezers just so we have a finished object for now. And this one's pretty easy to hold on to. But there we go. Okay. Yeah. Questions?
When you're using that piece of 3-mil and almost like drawing with it, where you can get enough heat like just rocking back and forth to like stretch out and make that piece a little bit.
Yeah, you don't have to be turning all the way around. You can even just stay in one spot. You can just kind of keep the flame kind of on the shoulder of the rod. So the rod has kind of straight sides, and then there's a point where it starts to taper, and right at that point where it starts to taper is kind of shoulder area. And if you keep heat on that shoulder, you can just draw out from that shoulder for a very long time. Any other questions?
Your larger pieces, oh sorry.
Sorry, yeah, sorry, I thought you were a ventriloquist somehow.
Are you annealing all of your larger pieces in a kiln, or do you flame anneal the bigger?
I anneal everything in a kiln. Yeah, pretty much all those big structural pieces that I make, they get to a point. A lot of times I'll work on them during the day and then throw them in the kiln at night. But I can tell when they really want to be annealed because I'll be like working on this part over here, and this part over here is going to. So, and then put it in an annealer and come back, and that doesn't happen anymore. So yeah, they all get annealed in a kiln.
And then you go back through and re-weld the parts.
Yeah, and it's with structural things like that, everything is held in place in 2 points anyway. So if it cracks, it's not a huge deal. You just fix it, and that's it. Yeah.
Is that what you base the size of it off of? Is
What's that?
the kiln you're working with, you gotta look at the size first before you...
Yeah, or know that you have a friend who has a larger kiln. Yeah. Mel,
When you work with the Boro color rod and you're pulling it down into thinner stringers, do you also do the pulling it out as you go? Or do you ever pull the stringers ahead of time?
with oral color, I usually pull them ahead of time. You're talking about like the way Micah does it?
Like where he pulls them ahead of time and then works with it?
Oh no, like he pulls. Micah Evans is another flame worker, and he has this super peculiar, difficult way of pulling stringers where he just, like I was talking about, heats into the shoulder of the rod, and he just feeds glass in this side and pulls glass this way. And it's super cool to watch it, and I've tried really hard to be able to do that nicely, but I can't do it nicely. So I'll just heat up a section and then pull it like that.
So you'll usually do that as prep work rather than like...
Yeah. Sorry, I did not understand what you were asking, but yeah, I pull everything down to 3 millimeters or 2 millimeters or a millimeter. Yeah. Any other questions?
Where are the next opportunities to learn with you?
Oh, teaching a class at Salem Community College
Okay.
in a couple weeks, I think.
Nice.
And then at Corning at the end of the summer or beginning of the fall.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.